questions, you can use the Q&A box. It might be hidden on your screen under more. And if you click Q&A, you can ask your questions there. And at the end, we'll direct them to our panelists. And I can see many of you already are using the chat box. You can type at any time into the chat box and make sure that it's set to all panelists and all attendees. And we have wonderful colleagues supporting us on tech to make this smooth. We have Nonna and Monica and Katie, and their names will be as tech help, so you can look for them and you can use a chat function to direct message them. We are recording, and we hopefully will be sharing this on YouTube so you can share it onwards with others afterwards. So I was going to invite everyone, please go into the chat box now, type your introduction. Great things to include are name, age, city and country where you are. And I can already see we've got people from so many places in the world, from Nepal, from Nigeria, from Canada, from Madrid, Malawi. I could go on. It's really heartwarming to me to know that all of you have come together because you care in this moment to be with each other and to reflect on this topic of a just recovery. So I'm just going to now talk about what does this mean, just recovery? What does it mean for us? We're talking about a just recovery as a way of transitioning to a better future in the wake of this crisis. If we can ask Tech Help to put on our screen, there's 5 principles that we've outlined, and the response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the related social and economic consequences that have flowed from this crisis moment. All of the responses from people in positions of power must uphold these 5 principles. This is what we would like to set a benchmark on and against which we will hold them to account. Number 1, in this pandemic, we must put people's health and safety first without exception. Number 2, the economic relief that comes must be directly to people. Number 3, it's workers and communities, not corporate executives, who we need to help first and foremost. Number 4, the responses can have the ability to create huge resilience, not just for crises like this, but for future crises, including the climate crisis. And we must be able to, number 5, act with each other across borders, in community, in solidarity, and not empowering authoritarians. So those are our 5 principles. So now I've introduced myself, our speakers, and yourself. You've introduced yourself in the chat box, and I've introduced the 5 principles. I'd like to move us across to hear from our first speaker. So May is our first speaker today, and I'm going to hand over the ball to you, May. Please take us into the next phase.
Thanks, Bridget. Thanks all of you for joining. It's really, really nice to get to see some of who is here. On these big webinars, sometimes you can't really tell who is joining. So thank you so much for adding your names in the chat. And I sincerely hope that you and your families and your communities are as well as can be hoped for in these very troubling times. I'm speaking to you from California, where I live and where I grew up, and where we have our lockdown in place until the end of the month, and we'll see what happens after that. But I'm grateful to be in a place where this was taken very seriously very early on. I'm going to speak about broadly the links that we see between COVID and the climate crisis and what we can do to fight for a just recovery. We've seen how people in a time of great change can dramatically alter their behavior and their way of living. We've seen how governments and companies can change policies and unlock resources overnight. when it is a matter of life and death. We know this can happen, and we need it to happen to address the very present threat posed by the climate crisis. Climate change is urgent and can also seem a bit invisible unless you are one of the people already impacted by it. But to many, it still feels invisible, much the way that the pandemic spread across the world so quickly. But its impacts are everything but invisible, from fires to droughts to floods, displacing millions of people, and just like COVID-19, impacting the most vulnerable first and worst. Governments can make changes overnight when they realize people are dying, and climate change is accompanied by this same threat to human life. So this moment really could be a turning point. And we've seen a lot of people celebrating the fact that there is a drop in emissions at this time, but that drop in emissions has come at the cost of human life. So it is not something that can be celebrated. But we can, in this moment, choose to put in place the policies that would make the transition to clean energy, the transition off of fossil fuels, actually a reality that we choose proactively. And that's what is animating me every day to fight for a just recovery, because so much change is possible, so much uncertainty is here, and there are so many good ideas about how to build the kind of world that we want to see. And many of you on this call, I'm sure, have been part of shaping this agenda for years and decades. And many of us know this is a moment unlike one we've lived through before. We believe that people power can be the force that enables us to build back better. Each decision posed by governments, whether they reopen businesses, whether countries pour more collective resources into supporting one another, whether the needed support for developing countries arises and comes without crippling debt. These choices are happening very, very quickly. We all know that treasuries are making decisions every day about broad-scale economic recovery. And those decisions could be the kind that actually fight climate change. Measures that are job creating, infrastructure rebuilding, and socially stabilizing. We know some of these decisions are happening right now, particularly the oil and gas industry asking to be bailed out in country after country. And we are seeing some leaders standing up against this and others not. But we can fight back against these bailouts now, and we can put our agenda forward such that when the economy starts to turn back on, there is a plan in place that is going to not take us back to where we were, because back to where we were was not normal. There's nothing normal about the crippling inequality that many people have faced heading into this crisis. We don't have to go back there if we work together. So those are some of the key points I wanted to make broadly. Now, speaking specifically about bailouts, because I know a lot of us are worried about this. The fossil fuel industry has been active and organized long before this happened, and they have put a lot of their resources to bear in trying to make sure that their economies and their financial balance sheets look better after this. But we can put a stop to that, and we have to. Any politician that puts the needs of fossil fuel executives before the needs of regular people, many of whom have lost family members in this time, needs to be removed from office and is not serious. The other thing we're seeing is that the oil industry is in free fall, and its volatility in the overall marketplace is creating economic havoc for the rest of us. The oil price collapse triggered by COVID-19 has put a lot of banks and big investors in trouble. If oil companies fail, they might go down with them. This is a stark warning to any investor who still thinks they can profit from fossil fuel industry companies. They can't. We just saw today Warren Buffett, one of the largest investors in the world, regretted the $10 billion investment he poured into Occidental Petroleum and said he doesn't want to do it again. We're seeing the kind of symbols that indicate that oil is on its way out. Any bank or fund still investing in fossil fuels today should be regarded as someone with a gambling problem who doesn't know when to quit and cut their losses. Central banks have a duty to regulate financial markets and force the banks addicted to fossil fuels to stop gambling with our future. After the 2008 financial crisis, governments were more concerned with bailing out the big banks that caused the crash than the people who were suffering, who lost their jobs, their homes, and their savings. 10 years of austerity should have taught us a lesson. Banks will take our cash and sit on it. This time, public money must be used to create jobs and usher in the zero carbon economy and the Green New Deal instead. The pandemic and safety measures being rolled out to slow down the pace of contagion are making millions of people worse off. Many live paycheck to paycheck and have already lost their jobs or may already. While people stop getting paid to work, they still have mortgages, student debt, credit card debt to repay. In 2008, public money was used and it did not support people to make those payments. This time we have to fight to make sure that our money is used to rebuild in the way that's going to keep us all safe. We can fight back on this together. The partners that have come together on this call mobilized in rapid time without any ability to be in person together to stand behind these principles. We can build momentum together to fight back, and we will. There's been unprecedented collaboration in this time as people have found new ways of working together. And I'm delighted to be able to work with all of you, to work with the other panelists on this call, and to think about what we can do to mobilize the maximum amount of people power to pressure for the world we want to build. Thank you.
Thank you, May. Yes to people power. And I'm going to pass the ball of speaking. I'm going to pass it straight to Bert. Bert, how are you feeling? Are you ready?
I'm unmuted, so I'm ready. Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak at this 350.org seminar. I'm the Climate Policy Officer at ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation. That's the umbrella organization of the unions worldwide. We have more than 300 national unions from more than 160 countries in representing altogether 200 million workers. And it's my job to work with our affiliates, our unions, to connect the dots between our traditional economic and social battles and the climate emergency that we are faced with. And this we have to do in a world where great inequality usually puts and often puts workers at last. So it's not an easy job because the conditions are very different in many countries. We represent workers from heavy industry to public transport, healthcare workers, people working in waste management, and those in working outdoors in extreme heat all around the world. For us, we see the links between the climate crisis and the COVID crisis. At this moment, we see many similarities, especially in the way we have to deal with it. And I'm happy to share with you our approach to it. Our first concern is, of course, to deal with the direct impact of the pandemic on the workers. Workers are often in the front line of the pandemic, literally. In the UK, more than 100 care workers have died, 45 bus drivers. In Italy, 40 care workers died. And these are just numbers of people in developed countries. And these are the people that are mostly have low wages and doing what is now seen as essential work. Also, these people died in most cases due to the lack of protective equipment. So these were avoidable deaths. So that's the first thing we have to deal with. The second is the impact on unemployment. May has been explaining that also very much. In India, for example, 120 million people have lost their jobs. In the US, 22 million. So the second, this is the biggest loss since World War II. World War II, only 2 million people lost their jobs. Now we are at 22 million people losing their income. And these are numbers about people with formal jobs. Many people do not have like a contract are informal workers, and they have in that way no savings, no social protection, and they depend on what they earn in a day to eat in that day. So for us, the crisis today has brutally exposed the failings of our model of globalization that has been imposed on the workers. Public health systems have been debilitated by austerity. The erosion of workers' rights has exposed many workers. So that's the context that we would like to, that we see where we have to prepare our reply as unions. And then we have 5 streams where we are working on. First, it's evident we have to give and provide workers with protective equipment to do their job. This is not evident in many countries. Second, it's crucial that we have social protection schemes to help people that lose their jobs and their incomes. For example, in my country, in Belgium, people that can become temporarily unemployed, and then you receive 70% of your income, of your wage, at least if you're not a flex worker, because flex workers on independence contracts, they don't get anything. So, but in many countries, this is not the case. People have no sick leave, no capacity to work at home or negotiate ways to manage caring for your children and working at home. So these people have been laid off without any rights. The third thing is the huge challenge for developing countries with the immense impact on their public finances. We are working to ensure that the IMF and the World Bank provides debt relief programs to these countries. We see, for example, countries like Argentina that have huge debt problems since the former financial crisis. Imagine they're paying like 7% of interest on this debt, 7%. So there are financial institutions that are gaining money with the huge debt crisis of some developing countries. This is just unacceptable, especially today. Our fourth point is to protect workers in the plans that governments are drawing up to reopen the economies. Sometimes these are really unrealistic, irresponsible plans, and we have to take care of the safety of the workers in the first place. In any plan, we need social dialogue processes with unions at the table to negotiate them. And then our fifth priority in the crisis today is to negotiate appropriate recovery plans, as we have seen with the just recovery proposals that have been presented, and where we want to combine our social demands with the need to restructure the economies and to make them more sustainable. We have already good frameworks for this, to do this. We have the Paris Agreement and the commitments. We have the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations that can be that are a good roadmap for recovery and resilience. And then I would like to go to a concept that's crucial for us in these restructuring and recovery plans. That's the concept of just transition. For the union movement, this is central for the way that we deal with the climate challenge, and it's also very relevant on how we deal at this moment with the COVID crisis. Just transition, according to us, is important for anyone everywhere. It deals with the impact of the climate emergency on all workers, their families, and their communities. And it deals with the impact of climate policies on these workers. Remember the yellow vests in France that initially protested against the rise in diesel prices. They, I think, correctly said that it's not fair that they have to pay more to go to work with their diesel car, while kerosene and plane tickets for holidays and city trips are not taxed. So also the impact on workers of climate policies is an important aspect of our just transition proposals. Just transition is focused on having plans, having just transition plans and measures at the level of sectors, regions, economies, plans that help these region sectors companies to make the transition to low or zero emission companies or regions. So that's the first thing. The second part is social protection schemes measures have to be included in these plans, because there will not only be winners in the renewable energy sector, for example, there will also be losers, and we have to take care of them. And by taking care of people that have it more difficult, we can make progress in our transition. And then there is something important for the union movement. These jobs in the transition have to be decent jobs. This means that labor rights have to be respected, like the freedom of association, to form unions, to have collective bargaining, to negotiate with your boss together, no forced labor, no child labor, and no discrimination. These are basic labor rights that have to be included in any plan that that accompanies us in the transition. So this is the what of a just transition. What kind of plans do we want? And for us, very important also is the how we do that. And there it's about the social dialogue process that we often mention. Social dialogue is having the workers at the table discussing together with the governments, with companies on these plans. We have good examples in Spain, where they're phasing out coal mining and coal-fired energy together with the government. They're providing solutions for the workers in these sectors. But also governments in South Africa, Nigeria, Indonesia are starting to pick up these discussions with unions to introduce the social aspects. And this, for us, it also brings us to this year. And in climate policy, 2020 is very important. Normally, the governments should have presented their new NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. And now we want them, we do not accept any compromises from the government to delay these commitments. These are needed today, and they should reflect the ambition that we need. But they should also add this just transition dimension in it, so that we can, by giving security and trust to the people, we can build up the ambition level that is needed. We have already seen a few good examples of these just transition plans, but there's also bad examples. For example, the Chilean government a few weeks ago presented their NDC, and they have a whole chapter on just transition and the social dimension, which from our point of view is extremely cynical in a country that there is persecution of unions and of workers, and there is huge inequality, and the government is just not speaking with the unions. So this is a very bad signal. This is not the way that we want to see it. And finally, so we work on this just transition in advocacy top down on the level of governments and the international negotiations, but we also would like to work, we also work bottom up on the work floor with everybody in society. And there we are running now in June our campaign that's called Climate and Employment Proof Our Work. It's a global campaign that we will where we invite all workers everywhere in the world to start a conversation with their CEO, with their boss, their organizations, to see, is my company climate and employment proof? Am I sure of my job next year? In 20 years, how is my job, my company transitioning in the direction of zero emissions? And what does it mean for my job? Are we prepared for this? And we would like to invite everybody that has a job and an employer to discuss this and to share experiences, pictures, videos of how it goes, to show bottom up how everybody is involved in this process of making climate policies more social, because only when we make it social, we can get the ambition that we need. So this is our new economic model that we see before us to deal with the COVID crisis, a model that protects people, nature, and biodiversity, and will bring us to a more resilient and fair economy. And this just transition for us is crucial for the just recovery that we all hope and are hoping and are working for. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bert, and thank you for talking not only about the what we need to do to protect the workers, but also some of the hows, like how do we move forward in this moment? And how do we do that also while we're under like lockdown and quarantine situations as well? Like, but you know, social dialogue and talking with workers and having a seat, workers having a seat at the table is so important. Thank you so much. And as everyone just absorbs everything that you've been hearing Bert saying, I'm going to now pass over to Luisa to talk to us about youth and climate strikers and how they are responding and affected in this moment. Luisa, are you feeling ready?
Yes, can you hear me?
Great, coming through clearly.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for organizing this, and thank you so much for having me. I'm excited and very humbled. It's always a great moment, I feel, to be surrounded somehow digitally with people working towards this kind of future we want to see. I am currently in Berlin, where we are in a sort of end of lockdown mood, so people can do whatever they want to, sort of, but we can't hang out in groups and you have to wear masks. That's where we are here. And it's for, I believe, the youth climate movement, the youth climate strike movement in general, but also for us in Germany, it's a very difficult time, actually, given that right now governments start making plans to get out of the COVID recession. And suddenly we are juggling with billions of euros or dollars in a very short amount of time. And the climate movement isn't invited to take part in the conversation on how this is spent. So that is a very irritating experience we're making, given that this money decides on what kind of future we're living in. But maybe to start from the beginning, where we are now, until February or March, most climate strikers around the world were striking quite regularly. And even in March 15th were the last big strikes planned in London, for instance, in Paris. And those were the first big strikes we had to cancel. And given the pandemic, or the situation around the pandemic, it's a really decisive moment for the climate strike movement. Imagine there were two things that kind of pushed us in the past. A was that we made the biggest crisis of humanity a very personal crisis to us, because we said, yes, you can ignore the climate, but that kind of means you're ignoring us, your children. And while people are okay with ignoring the climate crisis, they're not so okay with ignoring their own children. That's the experience we made there. So that was the one thing. We said, this is our crisis, and if you care about us, you care about the climate. And the second thing is that we revived the whole mass marching demonstration culture. There was really, I think, Fridays for Future was a movement centered around those Friday strikes. We have no formal structure, no formal institution, whatever, but we have those strikes. And then there was Corona, and suddenly the biggest crisis in the perception of most people wasn't the climate crisis anymore. It was in the perception COVID, and mass strikes went on quarantine. So obviously that is another quite irritating experience to make, and some experience that kind of pushes us to, or forces us even to make decisions about who are we and how do we want to continue our work. And so we then decided to strike online, which we have been doing ever since. And we call this Climate Strike Online, which is actually, and I never experienced that, a very, very enriching experience, because people do actually participate and it's become a real thing. So people do feel that you can, speak up digitally, and that is seen. It has a new kind of empowerment aspect to it, because suddenly it doesn't matter where you are, if you're in a big city or somewhere in the countryside. That was usually really sad for people living on the countryside striking there without anyone seeing this, but now we are somehow a bit more even than before, given this equalizing effect of the digital spaces, sometimes at least. But then there was still the issue about the climate crisis. And we had this difficult situation, and I believe that has happened in most places, is that people suddenly felt climate crisis wasn't an issue anymore. Emissions were dropping, and we had, it was time to care about other things. And that was and is still a very toxic narrative for two reasons. One, obviously, emissions aren't dropping because of climate efforts, but because of industries that are collapsing, and that is nothing to be happy about in the first instance, because it's happening in a chaotic and unorganized way. And the second issue is obviously that right now, decisions that would usually be made over, say, a decade are crunched into some months. And those decisions, they implement money, power, structures, technology, infrastructure, and we will have to live with this for a long time. And so this should be the point where we go on 100% citizen participations, where future generations are taken into account. We will really think about sustainability in a new way, because we are forced to implement it right on. This is no theoretical concept anymore. This is something that we do on a day-to-day basis. But this isn't happening. And what we're seeing in Germany is that our government is fighting every single day to conserve and to create the normality we had before. That was, in fact, as mentioned before, never a kind of normality. It was a very radical version of normality that put profits before people, that put political power over the safety of people, that put rise in GDP before the conversation of our livelihoods. So that wasn't a concept that anyone would vote for if you would give them the choice. It was an semblance of bad decisions made over a long period of time that we were too afraid of to say goodbye to, and to get started with something better. So given this radicality that is uncovering right now about our reality, we are seeing that while you would expect governments to say, actually, let's make some good changes and make sure that we support people as best as we can, but also support the grounds that they need, they're fighting to preserve the status quo. And that is where we as youth are seeing a shift in the kind of lines along which we are fighting. So it is not the 1% against the 99%. It is not fossil fuel industries against the public. It is suddenly those who want to preserve a normality that was never normal, versus those who can actually imagine fighting for something better, a better version of normality that is more just, that is working with our planetary boundaries, etc. But that is a difficult fight, actually, and it is a difficult challenge for us, given that everyone has different worries right now. We are seeing, obviously, as just mentioned, workers around the world being faced with incredible challenges, but this also accounts for young people who are now, facing completely different challenges with their education, with inequalities, with elderlies and their families, with that things you would usually do growing up, educating yourself, experiencing new things, getting political, and those things, they're on hold right now, and we feel that. So saying, we're fighting for this change, saying we fight for better challenge, for better future, has turned also practically into something that is much more difficult than ever before. And that obviously contrasts so sharply with the importance, the relevance of getting involved right now. So summing up where we are now is that we are seeing how crucial it is to get involved, not to just fight for equality and to fight for, equality focused, value focused crisis management, but also speaking as someone who will have to live with those consequences for a very long time. This is also a question about generational justice. And we will not be invited formally. There won't be any card saying, hey, would you like to talk to us about the decisions we're making about our future right now? So we'll have to, step up there and squeeze ourselves in, jump into the conversation, even though no one actually, expected us there. And here we feel that Fridays for Future is in the fortunate situation that many of us have been organizing before. We have structures, we have routines, we kind of know a lot of things about organizing, about protesting. So what we did, maybe just to name one example, in Berlin 2 weeks ago, we wanted to celebrate a global climate strike. And given that we couldn't organize people to come together, we felt it was time to still take their protest signs and assemble them so that you would reproduce the masses that will usually strike. So what we ended up with after 1 week of very intense protest sign collecting, we had 10,000 signs laid out in front of the German parliament. And it was huge. It was very quiet. It was very respectful because people are still suffering, and obviously we see that. But it was also very much there. It was very much, impossible to oversee. So we laid out the signs and said, fight every crisis, because it is what we need. And we need to, combine those fights in a way that we, make the best out of this very dire situation. And we see that more and more movements are organizing themselves, getting started, finding new, very creative ways to speak up and to become an essential part of this conversation happening about our futures. And there, obviously, this is the time for alliances. It is a time where we come together with those affected in other ways to fight for our needs, because the lobbies are strong. And right now they are on top of the game. And when we say Corona will change the world, we very much don't know which kind of version of future of reality we're looking forward to. So yeah, that is where we are now, and we are keeping organizing ourselves, supporting each other as best as we can, while acknowledging that the situation is just very tough. And this is also a question of expectation management and of self-care for communities that can't be at the same space, but should share the same, values as much as they can.
Thank you so much, Luisa. And listening to Bert and then you afterwards, it's such a reminder to me how much what we're going through it's across countries, it's across generations. It's so powerful to see how the youth movement in Germany are already trying to innovate and be creative about ways to keep bringing pressure and keep talking about these issues publicly. So thank you so much for everything that you laid out there. I will now ask, Saño, are you ready to speak to us? Tell us again where you're sitting today.
Thank you, Bridget, and thanks everyone. Such a humbling and really humbled and honored to be with all of you today. I say good evening from where I am, but good morning to everyone else who are just welcoming today. Good afternoon to those who are just slightly behind my time zone. I'm sitting in the Philippines right now as we are all hunkered down in our homes. You may have heard that the Philippine president has ordered the military or the police to shoot anyone who violates the lockdowns, and that is a brutal way to approach this whole situation. And that's a kind of authoritarianism that we see in many parts of the world, using this crisis as an excuse to trample on our basic human rights. Thank you again for having me in this conversation. Always a pleasure for me to be part of this community. And like Luisa, I feel that everyone around here, even just seeing all of you on the screens, gives us this sense of belonging, this sense of solidarity that we all need during these times. And I'd like to talk about solidarity and what that means for all of us as we envision a different kind of future that suddenly, or unfortunately, suddenly has become more possible for us. And this is truly a moment of reckoning. This is truly an opening we've never seen before. Before I proceed let me borrow a few lines from one of my favorite stories, The Lord of the Rings. I suppose many of you love Tolkien. And if you remember that scene where Gandalf was telling Frodo when they were agonizing about the return of Sauron and finding of the ring by Gollum, Frodo was saying, I wish it did not have happened in my time. And Gandalf said, so do I. And so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. I think with all of us locked down in our homes, yeah, all we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. It's a harsh moment for all of us. A lot of us probably feel helpless, especially the youth who has been gathering a lot of momentum into mobilizing, inspiring many people around the world with the climate strikes, and suddenly you cannot go out there. But that is the time that is given us. I usually think of these lines from Lord of the Rings when I think about the climate crisis. Nobody wants the climate crisis to have happened in our time, but it happened in our time. And it's not something that we need to bother and worry about. What we need to worry about is what we do with that time that is given us. So it applies to both this COVID crisis as well as the climate crisis. We see a lot of fear. We see a lot of confusion, yes. And we now live in a world that is like dramatically different from the world we saw even a couple of months ago. But I would think we do live in the same world where the climate crisis persists and it has not gone away. We live in the same world order that has betrayed us time and again, including bringing us into the era of climate emergency and now also this global health emergency. This is obviously a very disruptive moment for the entire world. And it is leading our societies now more than ever, now connected more than ever, I would think, to challenge our present and think of our future in a very different way. And so we must put all of our weight behind in trying to make this disruptive moment work for what we desire as a future. And change society as we have known it, a society that is individualistic because we have been programmed to be individualistic, especially by profit-seeking powerful corporations. It is a society where there's a lot of inequality, a society that usually destroys nature rather than nurtures nature. It is a profit-driven society towards one that we need, an open, egalitarian, peaceful, and a society that is in harmony with nature and with public good as the driving force. I think it looks far. It feels like we're far from there, but the moments where things can pivot are often difficult to see when we are in them. And maybe if we just step back a little bit and understand a little bit more how this current crisis we're all confronting can allow us to truly take advantage of this opportunity. We also see the current circumstances as a perfect condition for the government and the elites to implement their political and economic agenda that will deepen inequalities, enrich the 1%, and undercut everyone else. It is also a situation where there is exploitation of the disorientation we're all experiencing. In some areas, in some places around the world, there is an assault on democracy and a clear objective to push through radical free market policies and self-perpetuating political agenda at the expense of the poor. And in moments of crisis, people tend to focus on the day-to-day survival from the crisis, and we place our trust to those in power. And that brings us to the question on how do we deal with this? What can we do? Now, this crisis has offered a pause from infinite growth, I hope, from almost everything. Well, not everything. The coal-fired power plants are still running as we speak. But I think someone I hold in esteem described this as a portal to the future, which will take us to a future we want. That was Arundhati Roy who said that. And we can make this health crisis catalyze an evolutionary leap. It offers an opportunity to address the root causes of all of the fundamental basis of injustice, of the climate crisis, our one-time, big-time, once-in-a-lifetime, perhaps, opportunity. And now I hope we all see as well the high fever, sorry to use these metaphors, a high fever for community support and action, despite many of us feeling helpless and locked down. There are many cases around the world where people are helping each other. We're probably seeing an unprecedented wave of kindness sweeping all over the world, and I hope we can sustain that. I also want to share with all of you that contrary to advice from experts, contrary to advice from authorities, I have decided not to stay at home. I may be at home for this webinar, but I've spent a great deal of time in the last 8 weeks joining a community initiative here in the Philippines, where we volunteer to drive frontliners, healthcare workers, because our public transport systems, mediocre as it was before COVID-19, was totally shut down by our government. And all of the frontliners have found it very hard. It breaks my heart to see doctors, nurses, hospital workers walking for miles on end for at least 2 hours to get to their hospitals. And we could not bear that. That's why a community initiative was formed very quickly on day one to help our frontliners and also to distribute food to communities that are going hungry. And there is a clear, massive, infectious kind of solidarity that we see. There's also a lot of tiredness from political inaction, and we also see a lot of dry coughing of resources and the economy. And I hope that we all stand together to do that. And from that kind of confusion, we become a community that becomes proactive in our conversations and in our actions toward that future that we suddenly see as being possible. And therefore, we can look our children in the eyes and say, we had the opportunity and we found the courage, and that we had the that window of opportunity and we embraced that vision. So people power, compassion, community, these are the keys to containing both this crisis and, I wouldn't say the larger crisis, but the associated crisis of our generation. And they are, people power and community, these are the model for future leadership for ending both this COVID emergency and the climate emergency. I also want to emphasize that while the international response to the pandemic shows an unprecedented alacrity and seriousness, the international response to this pandemic is by no means a model for future cooperation. In the same way that the UNFCCC has criticized the response to the climate emergency, we also see how it is rightful to criticize the inaction and poor collaboration by governments, and especially to my dear friends in the United States. I really feel for you. And in this acute health crisis, there will be plenty of lessons for addressing as well the chronic climate emergency. Now, I don't wanna speak too longer, but I really want to emphasize a few points before I end. And our leaders, political leaders, business leaders, as well as all of the leaders we have in our movements, in our civil society movements, we must all step up, and we will hold our political and business leaders to account. We will find our agency together, whether that's offline when the time comes, or online as we can do so right now, and with the new approaches to direct action and unprecedented mass mobilization. We do live in lonely times, my dear friends, much more amplified by the fact we cannot touch each other, we cannot see each other, but we can change that. This crisis represents a reckoning. I refuse to call it a war against COVID-19. I don't think we are at war against COVID-19. I think we are being tested. Indeed, it is a reckoning, a representation of how the system has failed us. And in the face of such an unprecedented situation, the creativity of our response must match the unique nature of both this crisis and the climate crisis. And the magnitude of our response must match that scale. Entire societies must come together. Every nation must step up and collaborate like never before across sectors. And left on their own, even the best actions of each country will not match the global scale and complexity of this crisis. And this test demands more than ever a concerted, highly coordinated, fastidious, decisive, and most out-of-the-box action from the world's richest economies, and maximum financial and technical support for the poorest and most vulnerable. I'm talking about the COVID-19 crisis, but what I just said applies so well to the climate crisis. And it's amazing how when we talk about coronavirus, the same crucial solutions are exactly the same we need to avert the climate emergency. We are at war, again, not with COVID-19, but more with ourselves. This is a crisis that's seriously threatening our humanity, our ability to care for others, our ability to express affection and solidarity to each other, our ability to think of others instead of our own interests. It's testing our own humor and laughter, our connectedness, our very way of life. And in all of these, those who are at the margins of society, the poor, the neglected, they are bearing the largest share of suffering. Again, I'm talking about the climate crisis. But you can very well talk about how we get out of this challenge. So finally, I think the key here is that we become less of individuals and become antibodies against the global ecological illness, become antibodies for solidarity, become agents of genuine transformation. And despite those certainties ahead, despite the inequities in this world, despite our own follies as humans, despite our governments and corrupt institutions, despite the greedy corporations, we need to embrace the possibility of something better and welcome the opportunity to be instruments of hope. My friends, we don't have to be fearless. We just need to be courageous. We don't have to be blindly optimistic. We just need to be hopeful. And it's all right to be angry, upset, scared, but perhaps for the sake of humanity, to let the power of love conquer and allow ourselves to be candles in the darkness. There's one more thing I want to say in the context of solidarity. We want to remind ourselves that this battle will not be won or lost in the plenary halls. They will not be won or lost in those fancy government offices. They will be won or lost at the grassroots. These battles will not be won or lost in the chambers of commerce or chambers of law. They will be won or lost in the chambers of people's hearts. And that is why it is so tremendously important that with the great courage and conviction, we stand together like never before to confront the mighty and powerful, and we stand up for the future we all desire. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eb, so much, and what an inspiring finish as well. I saw how many people were inspired by the work that you're doing in solidarity as well with the driving essential workers. And I personally was very inspired at the end by your message about hope and courage. Thank you so much. What a huge blessing to be able to sit and listen to all of that. I know that our participants have been listening carefully because they've been asking lots of questions on the Q&A chat box, and they've been asking lots of questions live down the side. So that's where we're going to move next now. We're going to move to being able to take some of those questions. I think I've seen two themes coming out of the questions, and because we won't get time to address everybody's question, I'm so sorry for that if you ask a question that doesn't get specifically addressed, but I hope that by grouping some of it into themes, the speakers might have a chance to touch upon some of your questions all together. One of the themes that I saw coming out is things that you didn't see represented in the Just Recovery Principles. So where was a specific mention of tax justice or universal basic income, or where was a specific mention of debt cancellation or ecological crisis? So I guess I want to turn to our speakers to ask, how do you feel that everybody listening can address getting what they need out of these Just Recovery Principles and how they can build forward for a just recovery? Who would like to perhaps address some of that? May, can I ask you if you have any reflections on that?
And I was going to ask, maybe could you flash them up again on the screen just for reference? I do have them, memorized on my heart, but it's good to see them. But while we're doing that, very good points. And one of the things that I think is a challenge in this moment for all of us is there's a lot that needs to be fixed. And there's a lot of different needs in every sector of the economy that need to be addressed in recovery. And so these principles were an attempt to create something succinct that could be quickly put together, that could be something that many of us could sign on to, which happened. There's now more than 520 organizations globally who've signed on to them. So that's a good sign. But they, as a result of that, don't cover absolutely everything as specifically as we might want. But I would say in terms of the particular questions, there's a lot embedded in point 4, create resilience for future crises. A lot of what Bert was speaking about, I think, is encapsulated there, that a lot of these economic recovery measures are about resilience fundamentally. And so that's what, in terms of tax justice and some of the other questions that were raised, that's where I would locate them. And I think there's a lot of terrific work being done right now by a lot of organizations around the world to get more specific and concrete and actually interface with policymakers to say, okay, when we say resilience, we mean these 15 specific policy platforms that need to be addressed. So we're working with a lot of allies who are doing that work. And when I say people power, and when I said it earlier, I mean, how do we mobilize the voices for a just recovery with as many people as possible? And that may mean a broader set of demands, but it's a big deal to unify even on 5 demands. So that's what I would say.
Thank you so much, May. Anyone else want to take that point?
Yeah, maybe I would like to react, not to all the point, but I want also to make the link of these questions with the other interventions, because if we go to the 5 points and all the things that are needed for this huge overhaul of our economic model, in general, we know quite well what we are doing. We shouldn't be giving money to companies that don't pay taxes. we should help developing countries get out of their debt spiral, debt problems. But so we should put very good in the front the climate crisis, because many put it in the back and they say, okay, we wait with dealing with the climate impact till the COVID crisis is over. No, that's an excuse. We should not accept that this has to be attacked immediately now, and the COVID crisis cannot be an excuse to delay that. What I would like to link up with this is what do we need to do to bring these policy changes really in real life? Because the specialists know this, and we know all this, what needs to be done, but then some companies have better access to governments and are already making the deals now that will change, will have impact on our future from tomorrow. So that's why I think that we have to bring this, the mobilization, that the sympathy that there is at this moment in society for care workers, the rage that there is with the impact and the inequality of the COVID crisis, how it's affecting workers in the front line, and people showing solidarity with everybody that's being affected. We have to turn this much more in the mobilization for another economic model. And how do we have to do it? And we should continue to applaud on our doorsteps for the care workers, but we should organize on the work floor with the people that are with your colleagues at your work. We should speak with our colleagues, as Jep was doing with his colleagues in the neighborhoods to organize different food delivery to people, speak with the youth movement on having impact. And also this, in the end, has to do that people change their voting behavior with the next elections, because that's when you shouldn't be applauding this at this moment, supporting care workers, when at the same time you voted for the same parties that put in place austerity programs, austerity policies that are breaking off healthcare sectors and so on. So organizing is the link between the good ideas we have on how to rebuild the economy, and to mobilize people to do it on the work floor, in societies, in groups. That's what I wanted to share.
That's a super strong answer. Thank you. I really enjoyed listening to that. And it actually links really well to what I think is a second big theme that's coming through in the questions. And I'll try and summarize it this way. I think people are asking, how do we organize and mobilize when we're used to being able to go out physically and meet each other, and how powerful that is to be together in conversation and to be together to show the mass public power. How do we do that when we're under lockdown and quarantine conditions that could go on or come in and out for some time, particularly this year? So it's a challenge I'd like to put to the panelists. How do we organize and mobilize under quarantine? What have you seen? What have you tried that you're inspired by? And related to that, there were lots of questions around, like, how do we get youth more organized and mobilized? How do we get grassroots communities? How do we get workers? So I think there's possibly any of our panelists could address it. Luisa, you mentioned the amazing action outside with the posters everywhere outside the German government building. Do you want to say more about that? And then please be ready to chip in anybody else. And I should also say we're going to close in the next 4 or 5 minutes. So yeah, some quick ideas would be amazing. Thank you.
Very quick ideas. Yeah, thank you, Bridget. So I thought, because there were so many questions about how we did this, I thought I'd share a picture. Can you see this? Now this is what it looked like, and you see there the posters. And I tried to get, can you still see this? So this is
Yes.
what it looked like from above. And you see there, we just asked everyone, here you can see maybe some of the, so that you see all the small signs, and we made big banners and we drew out the message. It's basically what we did. And we put this there, and then we got a drone, which is really difficult because drones in front of parliamentary buildings are usually not what governments like. So that was a ride. But basically, just to maybe drop some thoughts about why we did this and how we did this. This should be the time, because we're making all those decisions stressed now. It should be the time where people are really involved and really ask, and citizen participation is the number one thing we do every day. Well, surprise us, we see that it's not happening at all for many, many reasons. Some are practical, but also some are very political. So what we need, and I think this is also the job of climate justice movements, is to create those spaces where participation can rise, where people can actually, contribute to something. So this is why I think having those values, for instance, is a very, very important step. Not everyone, took part in creating those values, but it is really something that you can share, that you can discuss within your community, and that is something shared, something common. And this is what we wanted to create here. We thought of what is our power right now. We can actually create something together. On this field, as you see, we could only have 20 people laying out those cardboards, which, is a bit of a job. But we took everyone's thoughts there and got them together. And that is not just important politically, because in digital spaces, you can always be overseen. When you send a message, people scroll and they just keep on scrolling until they see something they like, possibly. Having something physical, whatever it is, even if it's just one sign, whether it's one sign and a candle, whether it's two people holding a sign, it's much more difficult to oversee that. That is what public spaces are there for too. We politicize them as a climate movement, and we need to, keep this up. And so what we created, and maybe that is something that people would like to use, is we created basically a sheet, or how to organize in the times of shutdowns and time of pandemics, while respecting all the regulations. So this doesn't have to be 10,000 signs like here. It can be everything. And if you find smart ways, photos, sharing, circulation, getting media interested, there's actually ways you can do that. And it is not just important for the purpose, for the larger discussion, but it's important for the movement itself. Because, it was pointed out here, it's a very difficult time for people to keep up. And, providing this participational space is something that we do for ourselves too in the long run, because resilience doesn't mean only, creating money intelligently, but it's also about making sure that we keep up that spirit. And that is also what means resilience on a movement side. Yeah, maybe so much on that. And if so this sheet, this how-to, is available. I think Nico, who's on this call also from 350, has it. So maybe somehow that can be shared. And we now see that lots of people of the place are picking up the ideas of the protest signs. People are getting, into artivism much more. And yeah, I feel that is something that's a huge challenge, but I think, that's what we do. We face challenges every time. That's what the climate movement does. That's our main job, is doing impossible things in tricky situations. So, from a protest perspective, I have no doubt that we will find very, very good ways and creative ways and powerful ways in the near future to make ourselves heard.
Thank you, Luisa. Lots of people very inspired by that, as I can see from the chat box. Now, in the interest of time, all of your time is precious. Everyone that's joined us today has given something up by being here. I hope you've also gained something. I am going to draw us to a close out of respect for that time. Some of us have childcare and family responsibilities, or volunteering in our community responsibilities. And I want to thank everybody who's come to join us at difficult times. Some very early in the morning, haven't had breakfast yet. Some need to go off and have dinner and go to bed. I want to just close by saying how much some of the creative ideas really need to be tested and experimented with. The kind of art that you saw there outside the target of the German government, that could be repeated. I saw street art outside the head of Amazon, Jeff Bezos's house, demanding he protect his warehouse and delivery workers. I've seen people hang out outside their own homes for their neighbors to see. And I've also seen people to come together to put together what a just recovery means for them in their cities, in their towns, in their villages, what their local representatives need to do. And I've seen them doing that in digital rallies, held online, and also slower through surveys and through sharing information slowly about putting together demands. So I'm going to end by talking about what practical things that you can do next, some solid actions if you're inspired, if you want to carry on talking about this. This isn't just a webinar. Please carry on the conversation, carry on your questions and share your ideas on Twitter and Instagram and other social media spaces using the hashtag JustRecovery. You can also follow who you've heard today and their organizations on social media to see how this conversation is developing within their networks, and we'll put that up on the screen now. And you can also you can sign the Just Recovery Principles yourself, either as an organization or as an individual. You can find them at 350.org /just-recovery. And some key dates for your diary coming up. First of all, on June 5th, World Environment Day, we're going to be, 350 are working together with others to hold a virtual festival for our planet. It will have frontline activists, musicians, thought leaders, artists, political heroes, and with the world going through these joint crises of COVID-19 and climate breakdown, we're trying to create more moments for solidarity, hope, and guidance. It's going to be a really powerful global moment, so please stay tuned for more details. And Bert mentioned, but I just want to lift up and repeat, 24th of June, how do we climate and employment proof our workplaces? You can join that conversation and you can put that forward with your employers, and you can find more information about that on the ITUC website and look for climate and employment proof our workplace. So those are the solid things that you can do next. Thank you so much to all of our speakers, to all of our participants for all of your brilliant questions. And let's keep the conversation going as we grow our power together for a just recovery. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you for moderating.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Take care.